I'm the grandson of a baker. I was born and raised surrounded by burlap sacks of flour, damp wooden tables, and the lingering scent of burning oak. My name is Elijah, and for years I grew up hearing old tales while my grandfather kneaded dough at dawn. But there was one story in particular, one that never left me. It happened one cold December morning. The wind outside was howling, and the windows down the hallway rattled like someone was trying to get in. I'd gotten up to use the bathroom and found my grandfather already awake in the kitchen, quietly sipping coffee. I greeted him, sat across the table, and for a moment, neither of us said a word. That's when he slowly set the mug down, looked me dead in the eye with a seriousness I'd never seen before, and whispered, "I've never told you this, Elijah, but it's time." I figured he'd talk about his youth, maybe a forbidden romance, but it wasn't that. What he told me that night still makes me wake up drenched in sweat. I listened without interrupting, and he, in a voice barely above a whisper, began telling me what happened to him one early morning at the bakery. And even though he swore he'd never repeat it again, I remember every word, as if etched into my bones. He told me that what he saw that night wasn't human, that darkness has eyes, and not every customer shows up for bread. Some people think working before sunrise is peaceful, but anyone who's been awake between 3 and 4 a.m. knows. Something stirs while the world sleeps. My grandfather was never the religious type, but after that night, he was never alone when lighting the oven again. He told me that every year, without fail, he'd leave white flowers at a small altar behind the house. No one really understood why. I didn't either, until I heard this. And before we dive into the details, if you're someone who loves stories like this, hit subscribe, turn on the bell, and share in the comments what your scariest experience has been. I promise, after hearing this one, you might look at it differently, because what happened to my grandfather Robert that night wasn't a dream, and it wasn't some delusion. It was real. And the worst part is that it could have been much worse. So stay with me till the end. What you're about to hear didn't just change my grandfather forever. It shattered everything I thought I knew about fear, faith, and the cost of saying no when hell itself knocks at your door. My grandfather Robert was born in Brook Hollow, a small, dusty town tucked away in rural Nebraska, where time seemed to drag and the roads still looked like they belonged in the 1800s. The houses looked forgotten, some made of wood, others with tin roofs and chipped walls that hadn't seen a coat of paint in decades. When he spoke of his childhood, he always said the world felt quieter, darker, and lonelier. Since he was 17, he'd worked alongside his father in a modest bakery they built in the backyard. It wasn't some modern facility. There were no electric ovens or stainless mixers. Bread was made the old-fashioned way, hands cracked from the cold, flour clinging to clothes, and the scent of firewood burrowed deep under the nails. It was hard work, but honest. Robert would wake up at 3 a.m. while the whole town slept to fire up the stone oven and start prepping the day's batch of rolls. Back then, the streets didn't have lights. The only glow came from oil lamps hung beside doors, and sometimes not even that. Everything was dark, still, and windy. He told me that on the morning it all happened, his father was sick with a fever and heavy cough. Nothing too serious, but enough to leave Robert alone with all the prep. He slipped on a thick sweater, filled the clay jug with water, and walked barefoot across the freezing floor to the oven. It was nearly 3:30 when he slid the first batch of rolls into the roaring chamber. The fire cracked and danced, while outside, a thick fog began swallowing the backyard. He said it was so dense he couldn't see past the old well. The air got heavy with moisture, and even with the oven's heat, he felt a chill crawl down his back. He brushed it off as fatigue, kept kneading, shaping the next round of rolls. But something in him started tightening, like his body knew something his mind hadn't caught up to yet. That night wasn't like the others. The silence was crushing. so complete he could hear distant roosters, dogs barking somewhere far off, even the wooden beams of the roof cracking as they cooled. And then everything shifted. It was time to take out the first batch. He bent down, pulled open the oven door, and at that exact moment, he heard the sound that turned his blood to ice. A horse, not just any gallop. It was a slow, deliberate rhythm echoing over the damp ground. Like whoever rode it wasn't in a hurry, because they already knew exactly where they were headed. The hooves pounded with clarity, like thunder inside his chest. This wasn't imagination or the echo of something far away. Robert froze, oven peel still in hand, scanning the fog for any sign of the source, but he couldn't see a thing, only hear it. The horse approached, unhurried, every step precise and solemn. No one should have been around at that hour, especially not riding. Streets at that time belonged to stray dogs and lost souls, as the old folks said, not to riders with that kind of purpose. He thought maybe it was old Mr. Dalton, a neighbor who still used a horse for farm runs. But the sound wasn't coming from the side road. It was from the front, from the wooden gate that led to the dirt path. And strangely, there was no neigh, just hooves and a faint metallic jingle like spurs. Robert took a few steps toward the gate. The fog was so thick he couldn't even make out the frame post, just the blurred shape of the oven behind him and the faint orange glow of fire. His heartbeat picked up, not from fear exactly, but from a deep, disorienting unease. Like when you step into a stranger's house and know you shouldn't be there. That's when he heard it stop, the horse, right outside. The sound vanished all at once, as if something had pressed firmly into the earth. And then, nothing. Just the soft rustle of a drying tarp hanging in the patio corner. Already tense, Robert took a step back, and that's when he felt it. Right behind him. Not a sound, a presence. He turned fast, and there it was. A man, taller than most, wearing a sharp black suit embroidered with silver threads that shimmered in the oven's light. A wide-brimmed hat shadowed part of his face. He stood impossibly still, like he wasn't breathing. And behind him, the horse, as massive as a bull, its coat as dark as soaked ashes, and its eyes weren't eyes. They were burning coals, two glowing red embers that pulsed with an unnatural light. Robert couldn't move, couldn't even blink. The stranger dismounted in one slow, deliberate motion. His clothes made a faint clink, like something metallic hung beneath. He walked toward him, calmly, disturbingly calm. And then, with a polite but firm voice, he asked, "Got any warm bread, friend?" The fear didn't hit right away. It started deeper, like something under the skin. Robert, without knowing why, nodded and handed him one of the freshly baked rolls, still warm, his hand trembling as he did. What happened next was worse than any fright. The man took the roll with a slowness that felt inhuman. His fingers were long, skin smooth but dull, like the blood underneath had stopped flowing long ago. He held it for a second, studying its weight, and then cracked it open with both hands. The sound was sharp. Robert braced himself, expecting the usual puff of steam, but there was none. Inside, the bread was hollow. No soft center, no baked dough. Just a golden shell. Empty. A roll without a soul. The stranger looked up, fixing his gaze on him. The shadow from the hat still cloaked most of his face, but his lips curled into a grin. Not friendly, not mocking, just hollow, like the bread. "That's exactly what you are inside," the man said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Empty. You bake bread, but you don't know why you wake up each day. You rise before the sun without even knowing if it's worth it. You're tired, aren't you?" Robert wanted to answer, but his throat locked up. Those weren't vague words. They were precise, truthful. It felt like this stranger had dug into his mind and pulled out thoughts he hadn't dared say aloud. "Poverty's worn you down," the cowboy continued. "Loneliness weighs heavier than wet flour. Yet here you are every night, like the sacrifice will eventually pay off, even though deep down you know it won't. My grandfather told me he felt something between shame and fury. How could a stranger know so much? How could he describe so perfectly what even Robert hadn't admitted to himself? The man stepped closer. Robert, still gripping the oven peel, took an awkward step back. "But I can help you," the man said, with a softness that felt almost tender. "I can give you what you deserve. Cash in your pocket, women in your bed, bakeries in every neighborhood. Just say the word, and it's yours." Robert didn't know how to respond. This wasn't just a visitor. This was an offer, a temptation. And behind it, something dark. Something that made his chest ache, just thinking about the cost of saying yes. The horse behind the cowboy exhaled sharply. Its eyes still blazed like burning coals. The mist around them shifted, pulsing, like it was breathing. And then my grandfather knew this wasn't a dream. This wasn't some legend or figment. He was wide awake, and hell had come knocking, wearing a smile and speaking with manners. Silence thickened around them, as dense as the fog covering the backyard. Robert stood frozen, an empty roll in one hand, the oven peel in the other. Useless weapons against a man like this. The cowboy watched him with a blend of patience and certainty, like he already knew the answer, but wanted to hear it out loud. "I'm not asking much, friend," he said softly. "Just a word, a sign. I'll handle the rest." Robert felt a coldness crawl up his legs. It wasn't the wind, and it didn't come from the ground. It was inside, dry, hollow, like something was draining from within him. Like every second in that presence was stealing years off his life. "It's not a bad deal," the visitor pressed. "You know how much you've given to this craft. How many mornings you stood up with no strength. How many times you ate scraps while others took the best. Why keep doing it? Why live in the shadows when you could have it all?" What disturbed Robert most, he said, wasn't what the man promised. It was how he said it, calm, logical, as if he wasn't tempting him but doing him a kindness. "With me, you'll never wake up out of obligation again. You'll have bakers working for you. People will respect you, admire you. Just say yes." Robert looked down. Part of him wanted to say it. Part of him wanted to release the burden, stop fighting life. But something inside, a voice he couldn't explain, screamed that this decision wouldn't have a return. He took a deep breath. His chest burned, as if something jagged had lodged inside, and with a trembling voice, barely above a whisper, he said, "No." The moment the word left his lips, he felt something invisible let go of him. But the relief didn't last long. The cowboy stared in silence. The smile vanished. His eyes blazed brighter. He stepped closer and murmured, "That's not what I expected, but fine. If you won't accept the easy way, then you'll know what it means to run forever." Robert tried to back away, but his legs wouldn't move. The visitor turned, leapt onto the horse with unnatural ease, and vanished into the fog. But not completely. Because just when Robert thought it was over, he saw him again, right in front of him, smiling, like he had never left. My grandfather tried to scream, but no sound came out. All he could do was run. But even that night, was harder than he ever imagined. Robert bolted, not daring to look back. He knew exactly where to go, the far end of the yard, where his mother had once placed a small altar with the image of Our Lady of Refuge. It wasn't elaborate or grand, just tucked among old flower tubs and the bench where they used to shuck corn in the summer. He felt with a certainty he couldn't explain that if he could kneel before that statue, touch it, something might protect him. So he ran. But barely 5 steps in, the cowboy appeared again, right in front of him. There were no hoofbeats, no warning. He was just there, grinning. Robert stopped cold, turned sharply to his left, slipping between water buckets and the old firewood barrel. His heartbeat slammed so hard it hurt his ribs. He pushed forward again, running. As he rounded the laundry line, the cowboy stood waiting once more, hat in hand, laughing softly, like enjoying a game only he understood. "Where do you think you're going, Robert?" he said with calmness. "You can't outrun what's already inside you. My grandfather tripped over a clay tub, hit the ground face first, scraping his palms and tasting blood. Still, he forced himself up, knees caked in dirt. He no longer ran in any clear direction, just ran instinctively, trying to get away even if by inches. But every time he did, every time he thought he'd shaken the cowboy, he found him again. Sometimes just a few steps behind, sometimes at the hallway's end, and sometimes right in front of him, waiting, patient as ever. "How long are you going to live afraid of having nothing?" the man asked once, more firmly now. "How long will you keep clinging to effort when you never even knew why you started?" Robert wept soundlessly, not out of weakness, but out of helplessness. No one could hear him. No one was coming. Just him, the fog, the yard, and that visitor with no limits. His feet moved on instinct. The altar's outline came into view through the shadows. Less than 10 steps away, 10 steps that felt like 100. The cowboy saw it, and for the first time, his smile wavered. Robert screamed, loud, with rage, and charged toward the altar. If it didn't work, at least he'd tried, and the moment his knee touched the dirt in front of the statue, something changed. As soon as his knee hit the ground, he could breathe again. His chest, which had been locked tight for what felt like hours, finally opened, air rushing back into him. He wasted no time. He closed his eyes and clasped his trembling hands. "Holy Mary, Mother of God," he mumbled, barely audible. He wasn't a man of prayer, never had been, but in that moment the words poured out, as if they'd been waiting years for this, waiting to save his soul. The world around him still trembled, but he refused to look. The Hail Mary came out stuttered, broken. His body bled from scrapes. His sweat mixed with the dusty earth. As he prayed, he could hear soft laughter circling him, like the echo of a private joke. The cowboy's voice was no longer clear. It faded in and out, drifting with the wind. Sometimes it was right beside him, sometimes far, but always laughing, always mocking. Robert kept his eyes shut. The altar felt solid beneath his palms, and that was enough. His murmured prayers sped up, not out of faith, but desperation. And then, silence. A silence so thick that even the oven stopped crackling. The wind died. The dogs that had barked all night fell silent. The entire world froze. Robert thought he might have blacked out, maybe fainted. But no, he was still there, awake, terrified. Cautiously he opened his eyes. The altar was still there, wilted flowers, the statue of the Virgin, calm and still, and in front of him, nothing, no one. The yard was empty. The oven still glowed, but the flame had shrunk. The lanterns swayed quietly, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Robert heard a new sound, the horses' hooves fading down the main road, slow, steady. The neighborhood dogs erupted in wild barking. Some howled, as if something unseen had brushed past them. Robert didn't move. He stayed on his knees, panting. The blood on his legs dried in the dirt. But none of that mattered. That night he didn't know how long he stayed by the altar. Minutes, hours. But when he finally rose, he felt something inside him had cracked, and something else had been saved. When he finally stood, Robert felt like he hadn't slept in days. His body ached, legs trembling, clothes soaked in cold sweat. He walked inside without a sound. No one in the house had stirred. No one knew a thing. He said nothing. Not that morning, not the next day, not for years. He never told his mother, his brothers, not even his father once he recovered. He went back to the oven as always, prepared dough, baked bread, cleaned the day's mess, but something in him was no longer the same. The first thing to change was his routine. He never baked alone again. Even without employees, he always found someone to be nearby when the clock hit 3, a cousin, a neighbor, a teenage apprentice. Sometimes he offered breakfast just for company. No one knew why, but he did. He also stopped working in total darkness. He hung extra lamps in the yard, bought extra candles, even had an old battery lamp installed for foggy mornings. He was a practical man, but now had quiet rituals no one else shared. And every December 12th, without fail, my grandfather would leave white flowers at the foot of that same altar he had run to that night. Sometimes he'd leave fresh rolls, other times a lit candle. He never explained why. When someone asked, he'd just offer a faint smile and say, "Just my way of giving thanks, that's all." Once, my grandmother asked him if something had ever happened to him in that backyard. He only replied, "Sometimes you realize too late what truly matters." I watched him for years, and though he never spoke again of that morning, you only had to look at him to know something deep had changed. Some nights, he'd sit silently staring down the street as if waiting for something, or someone, to pass by. And in his gaze, usually so steady, there'd sometimes be a fleeting shadow, a shadow only I could notice, because I knew the secret. As he grew older, his need for quiet deepened. He became more reserved, more methodical, but also more at peace. He never complained about waking up early again, never cursed the grind. Bread remained his life, but now it had a purpose only he understood. And every time someone asked him if all the effort was worth it, he'd answer without looking them in the eye. Bread isn't made to get rich. It's made to feed the hungry. He didn't say it with pride or bitterness. He said it like a man who'd figured something out that the rest of us hadn't yet. Many years passed after the night my grandfather told me what happened. I was just a teenager then, but his voice, the way his hands trembled while speaking, stuck with me like a scar. I never saw him like that before, and never again. As I grew older, I started noticing things that once seemed normal, how he'd light the oven while glancing up at the sky, the silence with which he placed the white flowers each December, the way he avoided being alone in the backyard after sundown, even when he'd already retired. He never told the story again. It was as if he'd ripped it from his own tongue after that night in the kitchen. But me, I never forgot it. Sometimes, I'd wake up in the middle of the night hearing hoofbeats in my head, not really hearing them, but feeling them, echoing, just like he had described. Other nights, I'd dream of an oven glowing, or a hollow loaf of bread, or a wide-brimmed hat vanishing into fog. Then just weeks before he passed, my grandfather called me into his room. He was weak by then, his voice barely a whisper, like the smoke from a dying cigarette. He took my hand for a moment, didn't say much. "Elijah," he murmured, "be careful with the early hours. Not everything that smells like bread is safe." That was his farewell. No explanations, no requests, just that phrase, cold as ice in my chest. I nodded, not fully understanding, and he closed his eyes. After the funeral, I went back to the old bakery more than once. I wanted to step inside, but I couldn't. Something stopped me at the threshold. It wasn't fear, it was respect. Like I knew that place didn't belong to me anymore, like whatever he'd faced in there was still there. And one night, as I walked alone through the neighborhood, I passed by the rusted gate of the old oven. It was 3:05 a.m. I remember because I glanced at my phone before walking away. That's when I felt it. The smell. There was no oven lit, no one lived there, but the scent of fresh bread hung in the air, strong, warm, as if someone had just pulled a tray of rolls from the fire. I froze. I didn't see anything, I didn't hear hooves, but that smell wrapped around me for a few seconds, like a warning or a greeting. I went home without saying a word. And ever since, whenever I wake up at that cursed hour, I wonder if the cowboy ever really left, or if he just switched shifts. Today, every time I walk past the street where my grandfather's bakery once stood, something knots in my chest. The facade is worn, paint peeling, the gate rusted over with time. But the oven still sits there, quiet, as if waiting. I've thought more than once about firing it up again, about carrying on the tradition, kneading the dough with my own hands, feeling that scent of bread that reminds me of childhood, but I never do. Something in me holds back. I don't know if it's fear or respect. Maybe both. My grandfather Robert didn't leave riches behind. He didn't own bakeries across town. He had no luxury, no lovers. But he left something far more powerful. A story, a secret he chose not to take to the grave. He gave it to me, not to burden me, but to make me understand. Sometimes I wonder if he said no to that pact, not just for himself. Maybe he knew that if he accepted, he wouldn't be the only one condemned. Maybe he thought of us, of me, and chose sacrifice. Because he realized what seemed like a simple offer was really a chain, one that would bind him forever, or worse, drag us all down with him. And yes, ever since that night he told me, I've lived with questions that have no answers. Was it real? Did he dream it? Was it a warning wrapped in a tale? But then I remember the smell of fresh bread floating through the air that night, when no one was baking, and I know. He didn't make it up. He lived it. And now every December, it's me who places white flowers in front of a small altar I've set up in my apartment. I don't do it for tradition or faith. I do it for him and for me. Because if someone ever knocks on my door while the world is asleep, I want to know exactly what to say. Bread isn't baked to make you rich. It's made to feed the hungry. That's what my grandfather taught me. And with those simple words, he saved me from making choices that might have damned me one day. And if you're still listening, I want you to remember something. The most tempting offers often come when you're exhausted, when nothing feels worth it. And that's when you have to be most careful. Because darkness doesn't always come with claws. Sometimes it wears a smile, speaks kindly, arrives on a horse without a sound. And if it ever comes to your door at 3 in the morning asking for warm bread, don't look it in the eyes, don't speak, don't run, just pray.